Good morning and welcome to Deadline Press Agency's run-through of today's papers. This is Monday the 16th of November.
I'm Oliver Faramond.
And I'm Rory Reynolds.
We're going to start with the Daily Record on the front page of the Record, and this is the top sports story today. George Burley probably about 48 hours from the sack. The SFA having an emergency meeting tomorrow after Scotland lost 3-0 to Wales on Saturday. Fans are saying that he's worse than Bertie Vogts, which is an extremely damning indictment. I think it's pretty fair to say at this point that so far this year it's been a pretty catastrophic season for Scottish football. On page 2 of the Record, there's a few politics stories here. Alex Salmond and the Scottish Government are looking at changing the proposed independence referendum to a multi-option poll. It's a step back from where they were before. And Mike Russell, who's the Minister of Constitutional Affairs, and his team are currently working on it, apparently.
It's reported here that the opposition parties weren't happy with the wording of the question, but a lot of papers are saying that this is a U-turn for Salmond, as they will have to reword the independence question and include a question on more powers for the Scottish Parliament.
In other news, Labour are back on the campaign trail after their victory in the Glasgow North East by-election. They're targeting Glasgow East for the general election, and this corresponds to a real rise to prominence of Scottish Secretary Jim Murphy, who George Galloway in his column today says is the man to fight Alex Salmond. And this is where Labour's electoral success in Glasgow really comes to the fore. If they can take just a few seats off the SNP, that may well put a Conservative majority well out of reach. Politics on the front page of the Times, their focus on the Queen's speech, often seen at this time of year as the starting gun to a general election. It's expected that Brown is going to have a host of populist measures that he will challenge David Cameron to support.
Page 6 and 7 of the Times, and there's a spread charting some of the possible policies here. The education bill, which will provide pupils who are falling behind with private tuition, and also the health bill, which will ensure that patients which are not treated within 18 weeks can have private health treatment. And just a sidebar on page 7 here, the news that Nick Griffin will stand in Barking in London, and this is at the next general election. Worth noting that the BNP lost their deposit at the Glasgow by-election.
Of course, whether or not you retain your deposit, often seen as a benchmark as whether it was even worth running in the first place. Following a debate last week about how long the police are allowed to retain DNA samples, a man's been arrested in connection with an attacker who's been nicknamed the Night Stalker. The Night Stalker is thought to be guilty of as many as 200 assaults in London over 19 years, many of them rapes on elderly people. The manhunters cost £20 million, and they have been using DNA samples in their hunt for this guy. Although he never deliberately killed anyone, it is thought that many of his victims, because they were so old and frail, did die after his assault. On the front page of the Scottish Daily Mail, a story that we're quite used to seeing now, house prices bouncing back. Scottish house market, home prices have risen £10 a day, which apparently is further ahead than its English counterpart. And also on the front page of the Mail, linking to page 7, swine flu virus. Apparently a new strain of the virus is mutated and it's resistant to Tamiflu. 2 patients in Scotland are thought to have not responded to Tamiflu treatment. As winter sets in, this isn't great news.
There is another drug which can be used against swine flu called Relenza, but they've noted here that it's not been stockpiled yet in Scotland.
On page 18 of the Mail, the Australian government, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd, has apologised for the forced migration of 130,000 children from the UK to Australia. Many of these children ended up in Australia's foster system, being beaten and abused, and it's a long overdue apology. But the line the Mail have taken on it is that Gordon Brown has been criticised for apologising too late.
Once arriving in Australia, many of them were forced into manual labour instead of having an education. And they've noted here that this only ended 40 years ago.
Moving on to the Herald, on page 5, a great exclusive from their chief reporter Lucy Adams. Dr. Andrew Fraser, who's head of healthcare at the Scottish Prison Service, has written to Buckfast asking for them to change their packaging from glass to plastic because of the amount of bottlings that take place. Buckfast have responded to this, saying that the people who commit the crimes should take responsibility, saying, why attack Buckfast? Why not attack all alcohol sold in glass bottles? But this is a great story.
Turning to the Scottish Sun, and George Burley again on the front page. They say he could be sacked in 24 hours. The lead story on page 9, the Sun are calling Her Majesty's Prison Addywell in West Lothian out of control after prison wardens had to ask prisoners for protection. They've said that they've got an arrangement where they will give out favours in exchange for safety. Quite an unsettling agreement there. The privately run prison has been in and out of the press very often. It's maximum security and home to 700 cons. And they've just noted here at the end that Addiwell guards are being told not to record how many mobiles they find, so that Calix, the privately run company, can avoid cash penalties from the SPS. There's not that many Scottish stories in the Sun today, but this is certainly a good one on page 25. The government professor David Nutt, who was fired by the Home Secretary, is hoping to test out his new synthetic booze drug on Scots. And the Sun have got a picture of Rabsy Nesbitt here with a can of Safer Brew that they've photoshopped from Carlsberg. And they've got him looking sprightly below after taking the non-alcoholic booze.
Somewhat unexpectedly, senior figures in the Scottish licensing industry have denied that this new drug will be good. They said that it seems to focus on the effects of alcohol, but most people love the taste and what they're calling the atmosphere. I'm not quite sure what that is exactly, but there'll be some resistance to this, I'm sure.
Front page of the Daily Star. Jordan enters the jungle tonight, and they're saying that she's ready for girl-on-girl lust. Stories in the other papers have said how the other contestants are lining up to take pot shots at her. Not very popular, I don't think she'll be. And on page 7 of the Daily Star, Gerard Butler turned up to the UK Premier of Law-Abiding Citizen in Glasgow with his mum. And his mum, Margaret, was said to enjoy the super-violent action thriller. Moving on to the Scotsman today, and on page 7 there's a story about the two girls who leapt to their death from Erskine Bridge last month. Niamh Lafferty and Georgia Rao left their care home in near the River Clyde and committed suicide together. Scotsman have a good story here, saying that police have been called out to that care home 920 times in just 3 years. And turning over onto page 8, there's a story here about minimum pricing on alcohol. We've been hearing a lot about this in the last couple of weeks, but the Scotsman have broken down the various different kinds of alcohol here.
The top line of the story here, one of Scotland's leading health experts, Dr. Amelia Crichton, has said that raising the minimum pricing by another 50%, so up to 60p, will save as many as 900 lives a year.
Moving on to the Daily Telegraph, and on page 17 there's an interesting story surrounding a dispute over Anthony Beevor's new novel, the latest book, The Battle for Normandy. Anthony Beevor quotes a Canadian major saying that Scottish troops threw down their weapons and fled the battlefield.
It's a story we were working on actually yesterday on our Sunday shift, wasn't it? And survivors from the 51st Highland Division have spoken out saying that they intend to seek a formal apology from Anthony Beevor and that they suffered, in fact, from a failure of leadership.
And just finishing with the front page of the Daily Telegraph today, one of their stories at the bottom here is Tories plan a Big Bang revolution in the British media. Strict regulations on media ownership will be cast aside, according to the Tories' shadow culture secretary. He said there's a massive crisis in the media industry and that the regulations will be stripped away.
This move proposed by the Tories will mean a huge amount of competition for the BBC and comes just a few weeks after The Sun announced support for the Tories during the Labour conference.
And on that note, we'll finish up for today. Do join us tomorrow morning for a run-through of the newspapers.
Thanks very much for listening. See you tomorrow.